Hello students, this is Mr. McRitchie. Welcome back to my channel. This will be the first in I assume kind of long series of videos in which I deliver content for my remote learners. I have a section of my students in my class that are going to be staying remote for the time being, and kids that might be opting in and out of that throughout the semester due to COVID concerns or if they test positive or anything like that. So I'll be recording a lot of my lessons here on the channel and posting them. So this week we are doing a couple of big assignments in class. For those of you that are my students, check your email. I will be sending out emails periodically, at least one a week, where it's telling you what your objectives are for this week, what you're supposed to do, what assignments you might have, if there's a test, when you got to do it, what time you got to access it, blah, blah, blah. All those things. So that'll be your game plan / setup is check your email for all of that stuff. These videos, I'm not going to put announcements in these because there could be people from not our district who are watching them. This is our public videos, so I don't want to be sort of bogging it down with a bunch of stuff that only matters to my kids. I want to make it as sort of broadly appealing as possible. So with that all being said, today's lesson, and I'm going to continue it by doing like a two-parter, is over GDP. That's the first part of what is Unit 2 for us that we'll be covering. For those of you that are not in my class, I do follow College Board sort of unit breakdown schedule. Unit 1 being your basics, supply and demand, comparative advantage, stuff like that. Unit 2 being your measures of macroeconomic performance. That's stuff like GDP, unemployment rate, inflation, stuff like that. So I'll be going in that sequence. However, within each unit, AP has like Unit 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. They have like their own specific order of addressing things. I might not necessarily go in that order. So I cover the unit, but don't expect it to be like literally, this is video for 2.1, this is the video for 2.2. I don't do it that way. That's not how my classroom works. So I go by my sort of comfort level structure of how I do things. So this will cover GDP, it'll touch on real and nominal GDP, it'll touch on GNP, it'll touch on a bunch of math. So here's your first like disclaimer for Unit 2. Unit 2 has a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing with Unit 2 is that there is no new major graph that you will be manipulating in Unit 2. So Unit 1 had like the production possibilities curve and supply and demand graph where you have to know the graph, know what things affect each line, be able to draw that, blah, blah, blah. It's not the case in Unit 2. There are a couple of visuals that are required for Unit 2. One is the circular flow model to be able to understand that, which we already covered that in my class, so we will not be covering that in this video. And the business cycle, which we will cover at the end of this unit. And that's a graph, yes, but not one that you have to ever draw or manipulate. You just have to be able to understand it when you look at it. So those are the two sort of visuals, but they're not nearly as detail-oriented as like the production possibilities curve and the supply and demand graph were in Unit 1. The downside to Unit 2 is that this is far and away the most math-heavy unit in the course. There are a ton of formulas that you have to know. Sorry, my dog is right next to me, and he's apparently wanting attention. There are a lot of formulas. I have a formula sheet on my Moodle. You can look up AP Macro formula sheet and you'll find it. There's probably 5 Quizlets with all of them on there too. But I would say at least like 80% of the formulas that you need to know and 80% of the math for the course is in just Unit 2, which is kind of a short unit, to be honest. Like, we'll get through this short unit in 2 weeks in my class, but there are like 13 or 14 formulas that you got to memorize off of those 2 weeks. It's a lot. So be very careful. If you see a formula on a screen, write it down. Maybe have a specific page in your notes that is formulas for Unit 2. And then just every time you do formula, you just go back to that page, jot it down, and then go back in your notes and keep going. Okay, I'll show examples of how to solve each of those problems with each of the formulas and sort of explain the way through it. But be careful, there's a lot of formulas in this unit. Okay. With that all being said, I think we can dive kind of right in. I just moved my camera. That's not what I wanted to grab. Whoops, that probably looked really weird. Okay, grabbing that. There we go. Let me pull up the PowerPoint and work through my lecture. For my students, these PowerPoints are on my Moodle, so feel free to just pull those up when you want to. What is highlighted is like what is necessary to write down, what I think they will like use in terms of questions. So, this PowerPoint, this lecture, the stuff for this week, the sort of 2 days of notes that we're doing in class this week are over this one PowerPoint, GDP and GNP. What's up, Archer? Sorry, the dog has important things to discuss with me, I guess. All right. So, background information for the PowerPoint. I don't have the PowerPoint on the screen. This is the PowerPoint. Sorry, I didn't have it on the screen. That's my bad. Okay, this is the PowerPoint. GDP and GNP, that's the stuff we're talking about. Background information. Economics, macroeconomics. This is probably the most this is the most macro thing we've done so far in the course. So quick refresher on what macroeconomics is. It is a study of the economy, all of the markets that exist in our country. It's the big picture. It's a zoomed out view of choices that are being made by companies, by businesses, but mostly we're talking about by countries. Especially in this unit, we're talking a lot about countries and some of the math they do. We're not focusing on just individual consumer behavior. We're focusing on everyone's behavior. We're not focusing on just one business. We're focusing on businesses at all, like all of them. Why are we doing that? Why does this course exist? And why is this the one that is usually required for a lot of schools? A lot of schools prioritize macro over micro. The major sort of onus for this was the Great Depression, because global economic catastrophe, right? When you have something like that, it sort of puts a lot of incentive into figuring out how the economy works. Because you usually could just get by knowing how your business works. But when everyone's businesses got messed up by the same thing, maybe there's some bigger forces going on. Government especially needed some data and some information on, okay, we need to know more about how the economy works so we know how to fix it. So we know what buttons to push, especially when it's depressed economy, 25% unemployment. If that sounds familiar, it should, because present-day America has been hovering by that 25% unemployment number since COVID really kicked into high gear here. So macro, primary purpose of macro was two things. Measure the health of the country's economy as a whole. Multiple metrics to do that, multiple ways for us to do that. We'll talk about those in this unit. And then to guide the government to policies to fix those problems. So if we know how these problems exist, how they work, we can try and figure out ways to fix them. That's the purpose of macroeconomics. Okay, and why it matters for you guys is that if it affects everybody, it's gonna affect you too. So understanding what's going on in the economy as a whole will help you have an indicator of what should I be doing with my money right now? Should I be saving? Should I be spending? And you might be like, well, obviously we should be saving right now. COVID's happening. And I'll be like, well, actually, in recessions and depressions, the way that recessions and depressions get fixed is by spending going up. So people tending to save when there's a massive panic, even if you have money, make it worse. So if you've got money to spend, it's actually better for you to spend right now. One, prices are typically lower. And two, the country needs money to be spent right now. All right. So here's sort of the unit of Unit 2 in a nutshell. It is these three major economic goals and the metrics we use to sort of check them. So for basically every country worldwide, there are three big goals. One, grow. We want more money in the country next year than this year. We want to acquire more wealth. Okay, so economic growth, usually in terms of money. Second thing, limit unemployment. Have as many people having jobs as possible while not forcing it. Now that varies country to country. Some countries are cool with forcing labor out of their people. Think like North Korea. Conscripting workers and stuff like that. But generally, in the majority of countries, they want to limit unemployment, have as many jobs available as possible. And then for three, one that is always often overlooked is keeping prices stable. That one is hard. You have to really be active in pushing a lot of what I consider complicated buttons, as opposed to spend more, spend less. These are a little trickier buttons you've got to push in terms of keeping prices stable and limiting inflation. It means don't have prices go up too much. Now, in this unit, there are sort of metrics for each of these three. That'll be sort of the three big topics for the unit. When you're focusing over this unit, there are really three key numbers that we look at. The first one, which is the number associated with number one up there, is GDP. We use GDP to track economic growth. That is our first number. It's what we'll be talking about today. Unemployment rates, what we keep track of to check for unemployment. That one, people tend to be like, oh yeah, that's the number we use. And then CPI is what we use in this class specifically. Now, different governments use different numbers when it comes to tracking for inflation. But what you should be aware of is that most countries don't just use inflation rate. They usually use a little more mathematically complicated numbers that give us a better idea of, okay, how much inflation is each group of people experiencing. CPI is the Consumer Price Index. That tells us how much inflation consumers are dealing with on an annual level. So as opposed to inflation rate being like all the prices of everything, this is the prices of things that consumers specifically buy to track how much price stability there is for consumer goods and what people are buying at home. So we're talking about goal number one today. So our biggest measure for growth is GDP. What is GDP? It's a thing I've said a lot. GDP is gross domestic product, but definition, which is important because the definition has a lot of components that help answer questions. It is the dollar value. It is listed in US dollars in America, but it is also, usually when we use it for comparison, listed in US dollars, period, of all final goods and services, that's specific terminology, produced within a country's borders, meaning it has to be made here in a year. So it's annual. So it's sort of like those things stripped down. Dollar value measured in US dollars, we made up the number, so we get to use our currency for it. Final goods, that means the final product. That means we do not include things like intermediate goods. Say if we're talking about like the final price of a car. Like they say this car's final price is $25,000. Okay, that is the number we use for GDP. We don't also use however much the business spent on the tire and the stereo system and the steel and everything in addition to the $25,000. We only count the final product. Now, if the final product is like a tire or a stereo, imagine going to like a repair shop, and there's like, different car parts. Those parts in that store are the final product. Therefore, those would count for GDP. But we're only talking about the final product here. It's annual, and again, that within a country's borders bit is important too. It doesn't have to be made by an American company for it to count towards America's GDP, right? If it's made here, it counts. So if it's like a Toyota factory in America, even though that's a Japanese company, that still counts for America's GDP. And if it's a Ford factory in Mexico, that doesn't count for America's GDP. Yeah, it's America's company, but it's not in our borders, so it doesn't matter for us when it comes to GDP. So be aware that GDP can kind of underestimate your country if your country has a lot of factories in other places. Okay, that's a typical problem for a country like England, which is landmass-wise not super huge, economic impact-wise pretty freaking huge, pretty freaking big. So they have a lot of companies that have lots of factories and stores outside of their country's borders that don't count for their GDP. So this is a quick little like bell ringer / trivia activity that I do with my students. So if you're one of my students, or if you'd like to try, pause the video. Try and think of what the top 10 countries in the world are when it comes to gross domestic product. Okay, pause the video. Try and just think. Top 10 countries in the world. And we're back. Unpause it. So those countries are, America is number 1 at 21.5 trillion. This was as of last year. So that's 2019. That was last time I checked it, I think. China at 14.2 trillion. That's a lot of money, but there is a sizable gap there. That's a 2/3 difference that we're looking at. Japan at 5.2 trillion. That gap is also massive. And look at US to number 3. Germany 4. UK is still 5, and that's with their limited landmass size kind of thing. So they could be higher if they were bigger. Japan is similar as well. Germany also small compared to like these first two. India, France, Italy, Brazil, and Canada round out our top 10. Now, for us Americans, what's even more interesting is that 2 U.S. states would be top 10 on their own. California has 2.4 trillion, and Texas is at about 2.2 trillion. So meaning both California and Texas would slide in between France and Italy on this list of top 10 most productive countries in the world. So we have 2 states that are actually, if they were countries on their own, top 10 producing entities. That shows you the strength of the United States economy when it comes to global production power. This is, I think, a little more out-of-date chart. So if numbers don't match, just be aware that this is a little more out-of-date. So what does it tell us? Just like calculating your own income, it sort of gives you an idea of how well you're doing financially. Now, does this tell you everything? It's not perfect. It doesn't mean that America is the best country in the world to live in because we have high GDP. China is number 2, and a lot of their citizens don't have what we would consider a high quality of life. Brazil is number 8, and they have a massive poverty problem. India, similarly. So countries that are even in the top 20 doesn't mean it's amazing to live there. It just means their economies are very productive. Doesn't mean it's not useful, though. GDP can be used for a few things. So I'm going to move my camera out of the way so you guys can see it. There are 3 big comparison points for GDP that are useful. One is to check for growth. That's the primary purpose of GDP, is to see if our economy is doing better or worse than before. The second is to compare before and after a new policy. Say the government lowers taxes. Okay, well, what happened to our GDP after they did that? Archer, what are you doing? He's just growling. He's just gurring at me. Apologies if you can hear that on camera. So comparing before and after a new policy is the second one. The third is to compare with other countries and just sort of track for our sort of general welfare when it comes to productivity. So you can see, okay, well, we are number one producing power, so we are still a very powerful, if not the most powerful, economy in the world. Even though China makes more goods than we do, GDP is goods and services, and America, as a service-based economy, still does a heck of a lot of that. So what is not included in GDP? What things don't show up? Let me move the camera back. This is important to keep track of. AP exam loves to ask, hey, which of the following is not included in GDP? Or, hey, an increase in this would have what effect on GDP? And it's something that doesn't count, so it doesn't have any impact. So what's not included? Mentioned already, intermediate goods. So if it's not the final product, then it doesn't matter. Okay? So intermediate goods don't count for GDP. The second category are non-production transactions, which means nothing is actually made there. And same with services. There are services that are production versus non-production. Okay, can you go somewhere else? What are you doing? Go find something to do. So one are financial transactions. Think stock market for something like that. Also the buying and selling of government bonds or the transaction of different currencies. Like if I go and convert dollars to pounds, the UK's currency, the way that works is that I actually am buying pounds with dollars. That is a transaction. I am literally giving them X amount of US dollars for Y amount of British pounds. It is something that I'm buying. But nothing is actually produced there. Currency isn't something we list as like a productive thing, so we wouldn't count that as GDP. The second one, there is a used good. Nothing new was produced if there's a sale of a used good. Things that are being resold, which I should mention with real estate, it needs to be being actually resold, not rented. Those used goods don't count. So any resale market, any stock, not stock, oh my god, why am I blanking on this? Thrift store, anything like that. Those are all used goods. None of those count for GDP because those goods were already counted before. That's the way to think about it. So those goods were counted with the year they were made and sold the first time. So we don't want to count that multiple times over. If you're buying a used car, that does not count for our GDP. It's not a new good being produced. The real estate one I want to clarify because this part gets really tricky. Rent counts. Rent is like an active payment. It is, the way it's phrased in the definition of GDP is that rent is seen as paying for the service of living there. That is a weird way to sort of caveat it, but renting a place and paying rent, like me in this apartment, that counts for GDP. A home being built for the first time, that counts for GDP. A home that was owned by a family for 10 years, they decide to sell it to a new family, does not count for GDP. So if it's being fully resold, not rented, but fully resold, it doesn't count. So real estate has that weird sort of caveat because you can rent versus buying and blah, 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 blah. The third thing that doesn't count is illegal activity. Anything that's off market, off the books. So your, drugs, unpaid labor, black market stuff, all of those don't actually count for our GDP because it's not legal. So that's part of it. Now, that does open up some interesting sort of comparison points with other countries because some countries have things that are legal that are not legal here. Prostitution is legal in some countries in the world. So that service actually does get accounted for in that country's GDP, whereas here, since it's illegal, we don't count it. Even in the United States, this happens, where when Colorado and Washington legalized marijuana, their GDP went up by a lot. They had a huge increase in it, not because people were suddenly deciding to grow a bunch of weed, but because they already were doing that, because it is happening in a lot of states here. But now they could actually count it for GDP. So it made their economy look a lot bigger because they were actually able to count something that they didn't count before. This happened also in American history with Prohibition when when alcohol was made illegal, GDP, alcohol made legal again, GDP, right back up. So doesn't make our economy better. It just means we were counting a thing we weren't necessarily counting before. A much less crazy example of this can be activities where there isn't like taxes or unreported income is how I list that. So like a lot of babysitters, right? That's unreported income. That's not illegal. That's an off-market activity because it's not being reported to the government for purposes of taxes and stuff like that. So like how would the government know that you babysat and got that money? They wouldn't, right? Okay, well then that's not being counted either for GDP. So you're in kind of the same category as illegal drugs. If you're a babysitter, you're basically a drug dealer. Okay. In terms of your income isn't counted by the government. Therefore, it doesn't count for GDP. Time for some math. Time for some math. So this first video will have the simple math, the quick and easy stuff. The second video that I'll have over this will have the whole bunch of formulas, not as easy. You'll generally want a calculator for a lot of it, so they have to give you really simple numbers for it math. So that'll be the second video. Okay. So how to find GDP? How do we figure out that number? How do we figure out that we have like 21.7 trillion in GDP? So there are three methods for it that you have to know for AP macro. There are technically a few more that you can do that are a little more high-end and math-wise a little more complicated. The first one, which is the one that is most frequently used, I'd say on the AP macro exam 85% of the time when you're doing GDP math, it is with the expenditures approach. Expenditure is just a fancy word for spending, so all you're doing there is adding up all of the spending on final goods and services produced in a year. You take all the different types of spending that can happen and you add them all up. The second one is the income approach, which is kind of the reverse of the expenditures approach. As opposed to adding up all the spending, you add up all the income off of the sale of final goods and services, which should be the exact same number, right? Every dollar spent is a dollar earned, so if it's the amount of money that I spend on final goods versus the amount of money I make off the sale of final goods, that should be the same. The only difference between 1 and 2 is perspective, right? 1 is mostly a spending perspective. The second one is a income perspective. So the numbers that you're given will dictate which of those two that you do. The third one is one that College Board added last year as another method that students would need to know. I don't think there were any questions on it on last year's exam because last year's exam was way shorter because of COVID. It's called the value added approach. I won't get into that in this PowerPoint or probably even the next video. I'll do that later this unit. It is a weird looking formula. It is just a subtraction problem though. So what the value added approach is that they basically take the value of all final goods produced, subtract the value of all intermediate goods that were purchased to be used for the production of that good to see exactly how much value was added to our economy through the final goods themselves. It's a little more specific. You don't necessarily get the same answer using 3 as if you use 1 or 2. So be careful there. That one is entirely dependent on you being given information, specifically how much money was spent on intermediate goods to make the final goods. So that's one of those where, yes, that kind of approach does make sense logically and does actually work. As a means of calculating GDP, you usually get a significantly lower GDP off of 3 than you would off of 1 or 2. Now again, 1 and 2, that says both. It should say 1 and 2 will yield the same amount. 3 won't necessarily, but you won't be asked to do all 3 on the same problem. This will just be, hey, they give you spending stuff, do expenditures approach. Hey, they give you income stuff, do income approach. Hey, they gave you final goods and intermediate goods, do value added. It's all about what information you're given for which of the 3 options you choose. So I will focus almost exclusively on expenditures approach in this unit for the most part because it's what they focus on in the AP exam and it's, in my opinion, the easiest. So I like using it the most. So for the expenditures approach, what you do is you take the 4 components of GDP and you add them all together. These 4 components are an incredibly important list of things to know because they show up a lot in the course. GDP is a very important metric. These 4 components will show up very frequently for us. Those 4 components are basically your 4 categories of spending, the 4 different types of spending that happen in your economy. So the first type is consumer spending. It's just money we spend as people on final goods and services. That's it. A pizza, Little Caesars. That counts for consumer spending. 2, investment spending, or investments. This is capital I investment. That is, and I mentioned this the very first day of class that I teach content. This is one of the words that I make sure that people write down. Investment is spending by businesses on typically capital, things that improve their production. Capital, again, being like tools, technology, machinery, also higher quality of workers, things like that. So investment, so we've got basically consumer spending and then investment, which is effectively business spending. So consumer spending, investment spending. Government spending. Yeah, because the government is a massive entity, and especially the United States economy, we spend a lot of money as a government buying either goods and services, whether that be like machinery for the military or providing healthcare services for people and things like that. That absolutely counts. It does not include Social Security because there is not any service being provided there. Like being old isn't a service. So you get Social Security, that doesn't count for government spending. That is a non-production transaction. Nothing was being made. No service was really being provided. You were just given money for the sake of being given money to help out. Welfare, same idea. Like being poor is not a service. That is a unfortunate situation. It is good to give those people money if they need it, especially, but it doesn't like get added into our GDP. And the last one is net exports, which is exports minus imports. Move my head for a second so you can write that formula down. Exports minus imports. It's important to mention that there is a negative component there. So you might see this formula written as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The reason why imports are negative is because that's money that we have, that we are spending, that is leaving our economy. That is a negative for us. That is money that could have been spent on stuff here that is no longer being. So we count that as a loss when it comes to our GDP. So the more we import, it actually brings down our GDP a lot. And if you're American, you know, oh my God, a lot of things I buy are not made here. Our GDP could be so much higher. Yes, definitely. So here is the ultimate. Yeah, Ford Focus minus 2 Hondas. Here is the formula for the expenditures approach. This is the most frequently used formula for GDP, and I just refer to it as Cigixon. C-I-G-X-N. Cigixon. And that's an addition problem. It's just a sum total. Because again, when it comes to GDP, expenditures approach just said to add up all of the spending on final goods and services. It does, in each of these categories, need to be on things that count. So used goods, nope. Like buying a house that was previously sold, sorry, no, doesn't count for GDP, so it wouldn't go in here. You would not include that in this. Again, non-production transactions like Social Security would not count. But all 4 of these things do count for our GDP. Again, imports count as a negative component. So again, you can see this written as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And that would give you the same thing. Same idea. XN is just X minus M. X being exports, M being imports. I know that's annoying because exports starts with an E, not an X. And imports starts with an I, not an M. But we've run out of letters. We ran out of letters for acronyms and stuff. So we're going to use X for exports, and we're going to use M for imports because I said M for imports. There we go. My brain is working. Okay, it's still kind of early. All right. So really quickly, pause the video and try and figure out, is each of these, 1, included in GDP or not, and then 2, if it is included, is it C, I, G, or XN? So pause the video, go through these 10 real quick and just see, would that count, yes or no? And then if it does count, is it C, I, G, or XN? It's a quick little check. Unpause. Here are the answers. If you were to add them all up, there's the GDP. $10 for movie ticket. Yep, that counts. $5 million increase in defense expenditures. Defense expenditures is defense spending, that is military spending. In case you don't know, that's government spending, that counts. $45 for a used econ textbook. Used. Nope, doesn't count. 4, Ford makes a new $2 million factory. That is an investment. That is spending on capital. Factory is capital, lets you produce more stuff, helps you produce things. If it's a new factory, so I know it's not used, yep, that counts. $20,000 Toyota made in Mexico. Doesn't count. Why? Not made in America. It counts for Mexico's GDP. If this asks GDP for Mexico, yes. I should have said this is GDP in America. So $20,000 Toyota made in Mexico doesn't count for our GDP, counts for Mexico's. $10,000 profit from selling stocks. Stocks. Sorry. No. 7, $15,000 car made in the United States but sold in Canada. That's fine. Made here is what matters for GDP. Sold in Canada means it's an export. If it was made in the U.S. and sold in the U.S., that'd probably be consumer spending, right? Unless a business bought it for, like, delivery purposes. 8, $10,000 tuition to attend college. That is a service being provided. Education is seen as a service. So, like, paying for tuition or for college or for private school, yes. The job I provide as a teacher is a service. So whenever you're paying tuition, that does count. That is consumer spending. That is not a non-production transaction. What is being produced is knowledge. That does actually count. $120 Social Security payment to Bob. Nope. 10, farmer purchases new $100,000 tractor. Yes, that could be C or I. It doesn't really matter. The AP exam wouldn't catch you on that. Just be sure that you don't count it as both. We don't want to double count that. We don't want to be like, that's C and I, because that would mean that GDP would go by $200,000 there. not 100. So you just sort of pick a category and roll with it. Just be consistent. The U.S. government tends to label that as consumer spending, even though, in my opinion, I would label that as investment spending. But whatever. It doesn't matter as long as they're consistent about it, because as long as you don't double count it, there's no problem there. Now, if you're wondering, Mr. McRitchie, could they possibly ask us an FRQ based off of just that, looking at my timer, 25 minutes of content I've taught you? Yes, they could, random student. They absolutely could, because the AP Economics exam is freaking crazy. It's crazy in that because we cover, I don't say so little information, but like on the scale of like U.S. history, where there's like 350 years of stuff you get asked about, the scale of things that you have to know for econ is a lot smaller, which means you have to know them pretty well, because they can ask about things you cover in 15 minutes, like this. This is literally an entire FRQ from 2007 that was just asking, is this in GDP or not, and how? Which is a thing that we as teachers cover in about 10 minutes. So look through these, answer these questions really quickly. There are a couple here that are very tricky. So read them carefully, make sure you don't make mistakes. The average student on this, there were 8 total points here, because it was 1 point for yes or no, and then 2nd point for explaining it. The average score on this, I think, was 3 out of 8. So the average student got 3 out of 8 points on this in 2007. It seems like it should be much higher based on looking at it, but there are a couple here that are tricky, so read them very carefully. Pause the video and answer. And we're back! Unpause it. Okay, so going through it. A, the value of a used textbook sold through online auction in 2006. Way to be super hip to it, guys. 2006, eBay is a big deal. Really respect them being crazy on the nose with how relevant it was. No, that doesn't count for GDP. Why? It was a used good. It was already counted previously. So when they're saying to explain it, make sure that you write, like, why would a used good not be counted? Because it was counted previously. That's sort of the kind of thing they're looking for in an explanation. It can be short. That's a short explanation saying, no, it wouldn't count because used goods have previously already been counted in GDP. That's a 1 to 2 line on a piece of paper. B, rent paid in 2006 by residents in an apartment building built in 2000. This is rent, so yes, this is fine. This does count for GDP. Rent, you are paying for the service of living in the building. I know that's weird. I know. But rent does count. It is the resale of a final actual house that doesn't count. So rent is fine. C, commissions earned in 2006 by a stockbroker. This was the tricky one. I want to say like out of I think the average, what was it on this? I think 10% of students got this right. Because the answer you would assume is no, because stockbroker. The answer is actually yes, because this has nothing to do with his job. It's commission. That's an extra bonus. That is an incentive the work is providing. That is an investment in human capital. That is a type of income. Remember, there's the expenditures approach and the income approach. And this is a type of income. This is fine. This counts. This is in GDP. Doesn't matter that he's a stockbroker. If it was specifically the sale of stocks that's being talked about, okay, but this is not the sale of stocks. This is his commission. This is a bonus given to him by his job. That's fine, because that's income, and usually a bonus is for the idea of motivating them to work harder. That would be, technically, if we're at labeling C, I, G, or XN, that's I. It's an investment spending. That's businesses trying to increase their productivity by offering a bonus. I know. That's a big brain one. That one is tricky. I hated that one when I saw it the first time. I was like, that's not one. And I was like, oh, wait, it is. They got him. D, value of automobiles produced in 2006 in South Korea by a firm fully owned by U.S. citizens. Firm being a business, saying there's an American company out in South Korea making stuff. Doesn't count for, it says U.S. is GDP. Doesn't count for us. Why? Because it's not made within our borders. So, out of this 8-point question, again, 2 for A, 2 for B, 2 for C, 2 for D, 1 for the answer, 1 for the explanation, I would assume that a majority of people who do these problems get 4 out of the 8. If you understood the rent thing, 6 out of the 8. 8 out of 8 is hard, but 6 out of 8 would get you a 4 on the AP exam. So most of you guys would pretty much take that, and 6 out of 8 is pretty close to the percentage you need to get a 5. Because a 5 is roughly at like 80, 82% of your possible points, and 6 out of 8 is 75%. Archer, what do you want? Quick cam of the dog. What? It's a big baby. Okay, scrolling. All right. This is what our next video will be. So I'm going to hop back to the bigger camera real quickly. Hi. Wait, I'm going to move this over here so I don't look at the wrong spot. Hi. Yes, okay. So that is part 1 of the video. That is what will be, for my class, effectively Thursday's notes. I will end this video here, deal with my dog and whatever he's bothering me about. He probably just wants to play with something. And then I will record our next video, which is the math-heavy portion of that. That was mostly logic and understanding what GDP is, what kind of stuff's counted, what do I need to be worried about when it comes to figuring out what is GDP. There you go. The next thing is going to be a lot of math. So pop the videos over here. This is not the only video for the week, students, for my class. You have this one and part 2 that you are required to watch. So check that one out too. See you guys. Have a good one.